In today's video, we'll be studying bones, and here we have the outline of all we'll be discussing: introduction, cartilage, functions of bones, classification of bones, gross structure of bones, bone markings, microscopic structure of bones, composition of bones, ossification, bone growth, bone remodeling, bone repair, and bone disorders. First on our list is introduction. Now, bones form a major part of the skeleton. Okay, so they form a major part of the body framework of skeleton, and the bones, although they appear to be lifeless and dead, so to say, they are actually living tissues and living structures, and would be considering all of this in this video. Now, initially in developmental or embryonic life, the skeleton is made of cartilage and fibrous connective tissues, but over time, through the process of ossification, which we'd consider in this video, the cartilage and connective tissues or the fibrous membrane are eventually converted into bones. Okay, so this is just a general introduction into bones. Next on our list is to consider cartilages. Okay, now the cartilage is different from bones in many different ways, and in this video we'll be considering some of the differences between cartilage and bones. Okay, now cartilages generally form kind of like a model or a structure upon which bone would later on be formed. Okay, and it's also good for us to take note of the fact that cartilages are avascular, so cartilages do not have a blood supply or a nervous supply, so they are not innervated. However, they are surrounded by a perichondrium. Okay, now the perichondrium surrounding the cartilage is actually what provides the blood supply to the cartilage. Okay, of course, the cells that make up the cartilage are called chondrocytes, and since these cells are living, they need a blood supply. Okay, and that blood supply is provided by the perichondrium, which is a dense irregular connective tissue. Now, it's good for us to take note of the fact that the cartilage is a connective tissue, and typical of every connective tissue, it's made of cells and an extracellular matrix, which is made of fibers and ground substance. Now, for this video, we'll be considering three types of cartilage, which are the hyaline cartilage, the fibrocartilage, and the elastic cartilage. Now, the hyaline cartilage are the most abundant type of cartilage in the human body, and they have kind of like a glassy appearance, a frosted glass appearance. Okay, and they exist in different parts of the body. They could be on articular surfaces, forming articular cartilages, majorly covering the ends of the bones that form the joint, movable joints, and then they could form part of the costal cartilage. Okay, so the cartilage that joins the end of the rib to the sternum. We also have them as respiratory cartilages, so they form part of the larynx. We also have them as nasal cartilage, so the cartilaginous part of the nose is formed by hyaline cartilage. Next, we have the fibrocartilage. So the fibrocartilage is found in places where compression and tensile strength is needed. So we have them at the pubic symphysis, and they also form part of the intervertebral discs of the vertebral bone. Next, of course, we have the elastic cartilage. The elastic cartilage is found in the external ears, so it forms a major part of the external ears, and it also forms a part of the epiglottis, which is kind of like a flap that covers the larynx when we swallow food. The next thing we'd be considering under cartilage is the growth of cartilage. Okay, and would be considering appositional growth as well as interstitial growth. Now, appositional growth is generally associated with kind of like growth in the width, while interstitial growth is associated with growth in length. Okay, all right, for the appositional growth, what we have is this cartilage forming cells that line the perichondrium. So this is the perichondrium lining the entire cartilage. However, we have some cartilage forming cells that kind of surround it and line it. These cartilage forming cells secrete a new matrix, okay, that forms the basis upon which the chondrocytes are formed and more cartilage is formed. And because it lines the perichondrium, it leads to an increase in the width. However, for interstitial growth, what we have is that the chondrocytes which are bound in the lacunae, they divide and set a new matrix that expands the cartilage from within. Okay, so interstitial has to do with something that is within, while oppositional has to do with by the side. Okay, so on the sides. So in other words, interstitial growth leads to an increase in the length. Now, very quickly, we'll be considering some of the differences between cartilage and bones. So we have cartilage versus bones. It's good for us to take note of the fact that through our study would come across things such as calcified cartilage, and it's very important for us to take note of the fact that calcified cartilage is not bone. Okay, now we have calcification of cartilage in ossification as one of the steps in ossification. However, calcified cartilage is not bone, because taking a clear look at the basis for the formation of cartilage versus the basis for the formation of bones, we can see that the cells that form the cartilage are chondrocytes, okay, while the cells that form bones are osteocytes. And fundamentally, these two cells are different. Calcification of cartilage would generally lead to its hardening, but it does not automatically make the cartilage a bone. So we'll be considering some of the differences between a cartilage and a bone. So we considered earlier that the cartilage is generally surrounded by this dense irregular connective tissue called the perichondrium. Okay, now bones also have this surrounding tissue, but in the case of bone it's called periosteum. We also stated earlier that cartilages are avascular, they are not innervated and they are avascular. So we have here that cartilages are avascular, while bones on the other hand are actually supplied by blood vessels and nerves. And this may seem ironical because bones seem so lifeless. However, a good way to understand that bones are actually living structures is to think of the amount of pain, the excruciating pain that is felt when a bone is broken. This pain would not be experienced if bones were indeed lifeless and dead. Okay, so bones are indeed living and active structures. Also, we have chondrocytes in lacunae. Okay, so the lacunae is kind of like a box that holds the chondrocytes. Okay, so this would be the lacunae, and then the chondrocytes would be in the lacunae. Okay, same thing for the bones. We also have bone cells called osteocytes in lacunae. Another thing for us to take note of is the fact that generally cartilages have a flexible extracellular matrix. So the extracellular matrix is basically made of ground substance and fibers, and the extracellular matrix of cartilage is generally more flexible and, as compared to the bone, which has a more rigid extracellular matrix. So this has a flexible extracellular matrix, while this has a rigid extracellular matrix, and it explains why we can say relatively that cartilage is kind of flexible and bones are more rigid. Cartilages are able to bend without necessarily breaking. Bones, on the other hand, especially when fully formed, cannot essentially bend, and they do not have as much flexibility as cartilages do. Now, it's also important for us to take note of the fact that the rigidity of the extracellular matrix of bone is majorly due to the presence of inorganic calcium salt, as we'll go on to see when we consider the chemical composition of bones, we would get to see that the composition of bone is made up of both inorganic and organic components. Lastly, in terms of growth, cartilages exhibit appositional growth as well as interstitial growth. However, bones exhibit positional growth only, okay, as we would go on to see. So this is all we'll be considering in this video for cartilages. First, we saw that cartilages are essentially connective tissues, and typically of connective tissues, they contain the cells, chondrocytes, and an extracellular matrix, which is made of ground substance and fibers. Then we saw that cartilages have a flexible extracellular matrix. They are surrounded by dense irregular connective tissues called perichondrium, and we saw that calcified cartilage is not bone. So far, we have considered a general introduction into our topic for today. We have taken a brief look at cartilages, and so next that we'll have to study is the functions of bones. As we would see, bones have numerous functions, and for this video we'll be considering about 4 to 5 functions of bones. The first on our list is support. Bones provide support for the body, okay, and this support is in terms of weight bearing. Now, taking a look at the bones of the lower limb, we can see that these bones act as pillars that help to support the entire weight of the trunk and the upper body, okay, so they provide support for the body. Also, the bones of the thoracic cage, they also help to provide support just in general. The next function of bones would be considering is protection. Now, in terms of protection, bones have a protective function for certain delicate and essential organs of the body. Just taking a look at the cranium, providing a shield for the brain, taking a look at the vertebral bone, which provides protection for the spinal cord, and the rib cage, which provides protection for the heart and the thoracic organs. Next is anchorage. Now, anchorage generally has to do with a surface for attachment. So we can see that throughout our body, most muscles have an attachment to bones. Okay, now bones help to provide the surface area for muscle attachments, and this is anchorage. The term for this is anchorage, and it's by the action of these muscles that we can move and perform certain locomotive functions. The next would be considering is mineral storage. Now, when we were considering the differences between cartilages and bones, we saw that essentially bones have a rigid extracellular matrix, and we also saw that the rigidity of this matrix is due to the fact that the extracellular matrix contains inorganic salt of calcium, for example. Now, bones provide an essential mineral storage. They serve as reservoir for minerals, and most of these minerals include minerals of calcium and phosphate. These stored minerals are released into the blood when there is a deficiency of some sort, and we would see this when we're considering bone remodeling. We would see that breaking down of bone by the osteoclast can be induced by a deficiency in certain minerals, so that these minerals can be released into the bloodstream. The next function would be considering is blood cell formation. Now, a special term for this is hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is divided into erythropoiesis, leukopoiesis, and thrombopoiesis. Okay, and it's important for us to take note of the fact that this blood cell formation actually takes place in bone marrows, specifically red bone marrow. And as we would go on to see, this red bone marrow has varying location in children or in infants as well as in adults. The next function we'll be considering is fat storage, which is also called triglyceride storage. And as we would see, bones have a yellow marrow, and this yellow marrow helps in the storage of fat in the body, and this is majorly in the cavities of long bones. So in infant or in embryonic life, we have red bone marrows in the long bones. However, in adults' life, we have these red bone marrows replaced by the yellow marrow where fat is stored. However, it's very important for us to take note of the fact that in very severe cases of anemia and a decreased blood count, we can actually have this yellow marrow converting into red marrow just to reduce the effect of the blood deficiency. It's also good for us to take note of the last function we'll be considering for this video, which is hormone production. So far, we considered support, we considered protection, we considered anchorage, mineral storage, blood cell formation, and fat storage. Those functions are kind of very common and very popular. We know those as functions of bones in general. However, hormone production may not be so well known. Now, it's good for us to take note of the fact that the bones actually help to produce what we call osteocalcine. Now, osteocalcine is a hormone that helps to regulate insulin production or insulin secretion. And of course, we know that insulin plays a key role in glucose homeostasis. Okay, so when there's excess blood glucose, excess blood sugar, we know that it's converted into glycogen with the help of insulin. So osteocalcine is of importance, of great importance. So far, we have gone through the introduction, we have taken a brief look at cartilages, then we have seen the functions of bones. Now let's take a look at the way in which bones are classified. Bones are generally classified based on their location as well as their shape. The first classification we'll be considering is bone classification based on location. Now, in classifying bones based on location, we have the bones that form the axial skeleton as well as the bones that form the appendicular skeleton. The bones that form the axial skeleton are bones that form the axis of the body. Taking a look at the long axis of the body, we can see that there are some bones that lie in this region. Okay, the bones of the skull, the vertebral bones, the rib cage, these are the bones that form the axial skeleton, the long axis of the body. And generally speaking, just taking a look at the bones of the axial skeleton, these bones provide protection. And for the skull, they provide protection for the brain. The vertebral bones, the vertebral column, it provides protection for the spinal cord. The rib cage provides protection for the thoracic organs like the heart and the lungs. Okay, so they provide protection in general. They also provide support and they help to carry other body parts. Okay, now the appendicular skeleton, from the word appendicular, they are appendages, so kind of like attachments. They are attachment to the axial skeleton. The bones that form the appendicular skeleton, bones that form the girdles. Okay, so we have the pectoral girdle as well as the pelvic girdle. Now, pectoral generally has to do with the chest or breast region, and a girdle is simply a structure that surrounds something. Okay, the pectoral girdle is the structure that helps to attach the upper limb to the axial skeleton, and it's made of the clavicle as well as the scapula. Okay, so these two bones form the pectoral girdle. Now, in taking a look at the pelvic girdle, the pelvic generally has to do with the hip. Okay, so the pelvic girdle is the bone that kind of forms the hip. Okay, and it's made up of the hip bone, and the hip bone, as we'll go on to see, is actually made up of three bones that later on fuse together, and these three bones are the ilium, the ischium, and then the pubis. Okay, these three bones fuse together to form the hip bone, and it's sometimes called the innominate bone, as would later on get to see. These girdle structures of course form part of the appendicular skeleton, and they help to attach the bones of the upper limb, that's for the pectoral girdle, and then the bones of the lower limb for the pelvic girdle. They help to attach these bones to the axial skeleton. And of course, all the bones of the upper and lower limb form part of the appendicular skeleton. So this is the way in which bones are classified based on location. Now, generally, considering the bones of the appendicular skeleton, I earlier stated that the bones of the axial skeleton help to protect protection and support and attachments for the appendicular skeleton. Now, however, taking a look at the appendicular skeleton helps to provide movement, manipulative movement of the hand. Okay, and then of course for the leg we can see a lot of locomotion. The other classification of bones we'd be considering in this video is based on shape, and here we have long bones, short bones, irregular bones, and flat bones. Now, taking a look at long bones have their name this way because they are longer than they are wider. However, not all long bones are necessarily long in the real sense of it. For example, the bones of the phalanges are said to be long bones, but they are not essentially physically long as we have the long bones of the arm, which is the humerus, or the long bones of the thigh, the femur. Okay, so long bones are generally bones that are longer than wider. It's also good for us to take note of the fact that long bones have two ends and a shaft. In some text, we have this as epiphysis and diaphysis. Okay, so the ends are the epiphysis and the shafts are the diaphysis. Now, this is usually due to the fact that physis just generally has to do with growth. The epiphysis get their name or derive their name from the fact that in the initial bone growth, the epiphyses do not essentially attach to the diaphysis, so they grow individually. As we would get to see all of this when we consider ossification, and would see that we have an epiphyseal plate and then the epiphysis. This just to accommodate for growth in general. It's good for us to take note of the fact that all the bones of the limbs are long bones, except the bones of the carpals, the bones of the tarsals in the lower limb, as well as the kneecap. So the humerus is a long bone, ulna and radius long bone in the lower limb, femur, tibia and fibula, all long bones. These, however, are the only exception to the bones of the limb. Okay, carpals, tarsals, and the kneecap, they are not long bones. Okay, so it's important for us to take note of that. Now let's take a look at the short bones. Short bones generally have a roughly cuboid shape, and these are majorly the bones of the wrist and the bones of the ankle. Now, under the short bones, we have a special classification known as the sesamoid bone. Now, the sesamoid bone is given this name because it kind of looks like the sesame seed. A major type of this bone is the patella, also known as the kneecap, is a sesamoid bone. The next classification of bones would be considering is the flat bones. Flat bones, as the name implies, they are literally flat bones, and an example is the scapula, which forms part of the pectoral girdle, is a flat bone. We also have flat bones in the thoracic cage, as the sternum. So the sternum is a flat bone. Also, it's good for us to take note of the fact that most of the cranial bones are flat bones. Not all the cranial bones are flat bones. Some of the cranial bones are also irregular, as we would see. For the irregular bones, we have bones that do not fall into any other class. They do not fall as long bones, short bones, flat bones. They do not fall into any other of those categories. They have more like a complicated shape. The vertebral bones are irregular bones. You can't exactly say that they are short. You can't say that they are flat. They are not long either. They just have kind of like a weird and complicated shape. those are the irregular bones. Okay, so as I said earlier, an example would be the vertebral bones. We also have the bones of the hip. The hip bones are irregular bones. Now, very quickly, it's important for us to take note of the reason for the variety of shapes that we have. It has an architectural design to it, so to say. Okay, so we have long bones, we have short bones, we saw that we also have flat bones, and we have irregular bones. And as I said earlier, they have kind of like an architectural design to it. Okay, now taking a look at the long bones, as I said earlier, all the bones of the limbs except the wrist bones, ankle bones, and the kneecap are all long bones. And taking a look at the limbs, we have a lot of movement going on there, a lot of manipulation and locomotion going on there, and it kind of makes sense that these bones are actually long. And the reason why I say that these bones and their shape have an architectural design is because taking a look at physics, okay, so we have what we call levers, and we have the lever arm, we have what we call moment arm, and all of these things. Now, if we could remember some of our principles of physics, we would remember that levers are kind of like structures, machines that help to increase effort. Okay, so you have a little effort, it's kind of like an effort multiplier, so to say. Okay, and the length of the lever arm has an impact on efficiency. Okay, so the longer the lever arm, the more work it can do. A way in which I like to think of it is, take for example, you have a door, okay, and this door of course has a door handle. Now, it's very important for us to take note of the fact that when you have a door and you have the door handle has a length. Okay, so the door handle has a length. Now, kind of like, the longer the length of the door handle, the easier it would be for you to press down on the handle and open the door. However, in a case where you have it that this door handle has been broken, okay, a part of the door handle has been broken, you would see that it requires a larger effort to open the door. Okay, so you would have to apply more pressure on this short handle in order for you to open the door. So length actually has a role in reducing effort. Okay, and the length of our limbs actually helps to reduce the effort that we have to put in to move. Okay, imagine if the long bones of the limbs were short bones, a lot of effort would actually be required for movement. Now, taking a look at short bone, okay, you have this cup. You can fill up this cup with a big chunk of substance. So you can just fill it up with a big chunk of substance, or you can decide to fill up this cup with little pieces. Okay, just little pieces of that same substance. Now, the presence of these little pieces is like, you want movement, but you don't want so much movement. You want a bit of flexibility, but not in excess. Okay, now short bones actually help to play that role. Okay, so they kind of help to, there's a bit of limited movement, but the movement is still required and it's still necessary. Taking a look at the flat bones, we can see the flat bones of the skull. Now, I'm taking a particular view at the flat bones of the skull because, taking a look at the flat bones of the skull, we have the cranium, and they have this sort of vaulted curvature, and this vaulted curvature actually would see this playing out in a lot of bridges. So a lot of bridges have this vaulted curvature, and this vaulted curvature is very weight bearing. It has a weight bearing effect, and that's why we can see that we have people carrying some load on their head. people can actually carry a bit of load on their head, okay, and it's because of the vaulted nature of the skull that has a weight bearing effect. And I said earlier that this principle is also applied in architecture, because we'd see a lot of bridges with a vaulted curvature. And for irregular bones, they just help to fit in where short bones cannot play, flat bones cannot fit in, and long bones cannot fit in either. Okay, so we have the bones of the vertebral column forming the irregular bones, also taking a look at the irregular bones of the hip, okay, the hip bone being an irregular bone. So it's just good for us to take note of the fact that the shape of the bone is not a coincidence. There's an architectural design to the shape of the bones. Now, so far we have considered the introduction, we have taken a brief look at cartilages, we have seen the functions of bones, and we have also classified bones based on location and shape. The next subtopic for this video is the gross structure of bones. Okay, so let's take a brief look at the gross structure of bones. Generally, when we take a look at bones, especially long bones, we can see that the outer surface of the bone has this smooth appearance. However, as we'd go on to see, bones actually are not entirely smooth. Okay, there are some bumps and bone markings that we would get to see. However, bones generally have this dense outer layer that looks very smooth to the eye, and this layer is the compact layer of the bone. When we take a longitudinal section through the bone, we can see that the inner part of the bone is actually made of a spongy layer. Now, this spongy layer or spongy bone has a honeycomb appearance, okay, so something like this, and it's made of needle-like, very small needle-like flat pieces, and these needle-like flat pieces are called trabecular. That is why this spongy bone is sometimes called the trabecular bone. Okay, and we'll get to see there's a picture here. All right, so here we can see a picture of the longitudinal section through the bone. Okay, we can see that on the outer surface it has a dense layer, the compact bone. However, especially at the epiphysis of the bone, which is this region, we can see that we actually have spongy bone. It seems like it has a honeycomb appearance with some tiny needle-like pieces of bones coming together to form this network. Okay, and I earlier stated that these needle-like structures are called the trabecular, and trabecular simply means little beams. In between this tiny needle-like bone pieces, we have red marrow. As we'd get to see, it's usually filled with red or yellow marrow, as the case may be, especially when the spongy bone is at the epiphysis in an adult. It's usually a red marrow. This plays a role in hematopoiesis, and erythropoiesis is one of such. We have seen the gross structure of the bone is made of spongy bone and compact bone. This is the gross structure. However, we also have the microscopic structure. Taking a look at the gross structure of the bone, this is a long bone. Specifically, this is the bone of the femur. And it's good for us to take note of the fact that the amount of spongy bone versus compact bone that we have in the different shapes of bone. So we've seen the different shapes of bone: long bone, short bone, flat bone, irregular bone. The amount of spongy and compact bone that we have for these different shapes vary. And in this video, we'll be considering the variation. Just very quickly before we proceed, it's important for us to take note of this covering or lining tissues, the periosteum and the endosteum. Okay, the periosteum, peri has to do with around. Okay, so we have peripheral, around. Okay, so periosteum is on the outer surface of the compact bone. However, the endosteum is on the inner surface, it kind of lines the bone marrow. Okay, the bone marrow is this hollow canal, this hollow cavity, especially in the long bone. As I stated earlier, we have the compact bone and the spongy bone. Okay, and the amount of spongy versus compact bone that we have for the different shapes of bone varies. For the short bone, the irregular bone, and the flat bone, they have some similarities in the amount of spongy and compact bone. And as we'd see, they usually have a very thin plate of spongy bone. And this thin plate of spongy bone is usually called a diplo. And in some text, would see it has two markings on the E. However, this is called a diplo. It's a thin plate of spongy bone, and this thin plate of spongy bone is sandwiched between two layers of compact bone, and we can see it clearly depicted in this picture. In this picture, we can see here, this is a flat bone of the skull or the cranial bone, and we can see that we have this layer of compact bone on two sides. So on the exterior and the interior, we have the compact bone, and then we have the spongy bone right here. Okay, this thin plate of spongy bone that is called the diplo. Now this is typical of short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. Okay, of course they are covered on the exterior side by the periosteum and on the interior by the endosteum. Because these bones are not cylindrical, they generally do not have a medullary cavity. For the spongy bone, which we have here, the spongy bone, as I stated earlier, has this honeycomb appearance. Okay, and it's made up of tiny needle-like bones that come together to form this mesh, this network. This is an enlarged image of what the trabecula looks like. Within this trabecula, we have very tiny cavities. Okay, and these cavities form marrow. Okay, it could be red marrow or yellow marrow, as the case may be. However, this is unlike we have it in the long bone, because in the long bone we have a well-defined medullary cavity and a medullary marrow. Okay, and in the adults, this long bone usually has the yellow marrow for fat storage. Now let's take a look at the typical structure of a long bone. This is a long bone, and specifically this is the femur, okay, of the lower limb. And we can see here that long bones generally have two parts. Okay, so we have two ends and a shaft. Okay, and these two ends, in some text we have them as the epiphysis. Okay, so the epiphysis, and for the shaft we have it as the diaphysis. Now taking a look at this bone right here, this part of the bone from here down to here and here, this forms the epiphysis of the bone. Okay, and this is specifically the proximal end. Okay, so this is the proximal end of the bone. However, if we take a look down here, we have the diaphysis. So the diaphysis is in red. Now the diaphysis of the long bone is majorly made of compact bone, and as we can see in this picture, we can see the compactness of the diaphysis, which is the shaft of the bone, and we can also see a well-defined medullary cavity. So we can see the cavity here, the medullary cavity, and in adults this medullary cavity is made of yellow marrow. Okay, so for the storage of fat. Okay, we can see well-defined medullary cavity, unlike we had for the short, irregular, and flat bones. In this medullary cavity, although the diaphysis is majorly made of compact bone, and I said majorly compact bone because there's a very thin layer of spongy bone that actually kind of lines the medullary cavity. Okay, Now let's take a look at the epiphysis, the two ends of the long bone. Okay, now in this picture, what we have here showing is the proximal end of the femur. The outer shell of the bone, the outer shell of the epiphysis, also has a thin layer of compact bone. That's why when we just take a look at the bone on the surface, it appears as if it's compact bone all through. Okay, however, the epiphysis or the ends of the long bone actually have a thin layer of compact bone. The compact bone, it's almost only on the surface. Okay, however, going deep, what we actually have is spongy bone. Okay, the interior is made of spongy bone, and on the outer surface where we have the thin layer of compact bone, we actually have another layer of articular cartilage. Okay, so and specifically the type of cartilage that we have there is the hyaline cartilage, and we saw that when we were considering cartilages. Between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, what we have is an epiphyseal plate. This epiphyseal plate is made of epiphyseal cartilage in a growing human. Okay, over time, the epiphyseal cartilage is simply replaced by the epiphyseal plate, which is a thin layer of bone. This is when growth has been terminated, and so the epiphyseal plate is now simply seen as an epiphyseal line when the epiphyseal cartilage is gone. The epiphyseal plate is also made of hyaline cartilage. Let's briefly take a look at the membranes that cover the bone surface. As stated earlier, we have the periosteum, and we said peri means around, okay, and osteum has to do with the bone. So the periosteum is around the bone. It covers the external surface of the entire bone, except of course the articular surfaces. Okay, so the surfaces that form part of the joint. Now this periosteum is basically a fibrous layer of dense irregular connective tissue. In subsequent videos, we'll take a look at connective tissues, and we'll see that in the classification of connective tissues, we have connective tissue proper and specialized connective tissue. And under the connective tissue proper, we have loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. For the dense connective tissue, we have dense irregular and dense regular. However, it's good for us to take note of the fact that the periosteum is actually dense irregular connective tissue, and the inner layer of the periosteum. Now when I say inner layer, I mean the part of the periosteum directly on the surface of the bone. Okay, so we have the layer away from the surface of the bone. It looks kind of like, so this is the periosteum, so to say, and then we have the bone. So the bone starts with the red. The inner layer would be the part closer to the bone, and the outer layer would be the part away from the bone. Now the inner layer of the periosteum contains osteoprogenitor cells, and these osteoprogenitor cells are simply primitive stem cells, okay, that would go on to form actual bone cells. It also has bone destroying cells called osteoclasts and bone forming cells, osteoblasts. The periosteum is deeply supplied with nerves and blood vessels. Okay, this is why broken bones are actually painful, because when a bone breaks, it doesn't just break on its own. It actually injures these blood vessels and nerves that are supplied to the periosteum, and that's why the breaking of a bone is painful, and pain can be felt. And this is also why the breaking of the bone leads to bleeding. It's because these blood vessels that are supplied to the periosteum are perforated, okay, by the broken bone. It's also good for us to take note of the fact that we generally say that muscles attach to bones. Okay, so we generally say muscles attached to bones by tendons. However, it's good for us to take note of the fact that muscles do not actually, these tendons do not directly attach to the bones. Okay, the tendons actually attach to the periosteum of the bone. Okay, and at the site where the tendon attaches to the periosteum, it's usually very dense, and the perforating fibers, we have perforating fibers of the periosteum. These perforating fibers are collagen fibers, and they kind of perforate through tiny pores of the bone matrix. Okay, they are what these perforating fibers are, what provides anchorage for the periosteum onto the bone. Then we have the endosteum. The endosteum, endo means within, and osteum means bone or relating to the bone. So the endosteum are the connective tissue. It's a delicate, unlike the periosteum, which is dense, the endosteum is delicate. It's a delicate connective tissue that covers the internal bone surface. Okay, it covers the internal bone surface, and it kind of lines the medullary cavity of long bones. Just like the inner layer of the periosteum that we considered earlier, the endosteum also contains some bone cells. Okay, the same type of bone cells, so the osteoprogenitor cells, the osteoclast, and the osteoblast. Now, in speaking about blood vessels and nerve supplies to bones, when we were considering cartilages, we saw that cartilages are avascular, so they do not have a nervous supply or blood supply. However, bones have both nervous supply and blood supply. These blood vessels are known as nutrient vein. So we have the nutrient vein as well as the nutrient artery. They enter into the bone via the nutrient foramen, and this artery and vein is actually what provides nutrients for the bone cells and the bone. We also have nerves accompanying these blood vessels, also through the nutrient foramen. Now, as one of the functions of the bones that we stated earlier, we said bones have hematopoietic functions, and this is simply a fancy word or a fancy term for blood formation. In the bones, we have hematopoietic tissues, and these hematopoietic tissues are red marrow. Okay, now the location of the red marrow varies in infants and adults. Okay, so in infants, we have this red marrow in the diaphysis of long bones, and we also have them in the spongy bones of short bones. However, in adults, what we have is that the diaphysis of these long bones, which is medullary cavity, the medullary cavity of the long bones actually contain yellow marrow or fat, and it serves as a storage for fat. The red marrow is actually only found in between the trabecula of spongy bones, and considering long bones, these spongy bones are found in the epiphysis. So we can say that the red marrow in adults is found in the epiphysis. However, in the medullary cavity of the long bone, what we have is yellow marrow for fat storage and not for blood production. Okay, so in adults, the hematopoietic tissues that we have are majorly in the flat bones of the skull. Of course, remember that in taking a look at the structure of the bones of the skull, we saw that we have this thin plate of spongy tissues, of just the structure of flat bones in general. We have this thin plate of spongy tissue called the diplo. Okay, so blood formation takes place in the flat bones of the skull, of the sternum, the ribs, takes place in the clavicle, the hip bone, as well as in the vertebra. So we do not have hematopoietic cells in the medullary cavity of long bones. Most of the hematopoiesis takes place in spongy bone. So hematopoiesis majorly takes place in spongy bone, and since the medullary cavity of long bones is actually made of compact bone, okay, it makes sense that hematopoiesis actually doesn't take place in the medullary cavity, okay, because we have little or no spongy bone in the medullary cavity. However, in places where we have spongy bone, hematopoiesis does take place there. Okay, so for example, we have spongy bone in the epiphysis. Okay, so we have spongy bone in the epiphysis of long bones. So it makes sense that hematopoiesis actually takes place in the epiphysis of long bones. Okay, so within the cavities formed by the trabecula, we have red marrow and hematopoiesis takes place there. But it's good for us to take note of the fact that in terms of activeness and activity, the spongy bones of the flat bones that we considered earlier, so the bones of the skull, the sternum, the rib, the hip, and the vertebra are actually more active in the function of hematopoiesis as compared to the epiphysis of the long bones. Earlier in the video, I stated that in severe cases of anemia, okay, this yellow marrow that we have in long bones can actually revert. Okay, so they can revert to red marrow just to reduce the anemic effect. Okay, so it's important for us to take note of that. Here in this picture, we can see this is a longitudinal section through a long bone. We can see, of course, we have the medullary cavity. Okay, we can see the endosteum which lines the medullary cavity, and we can also see the yellow marrow. Okay, it's yellow in this picture and it serves as fat storage. Also here we can see kind of like this transparent fibrous tissue, and this is the periosteum. If we look very closely, we can see that there are some perforating fibers. These fibers perforate into very tiny pores of the compact bone, and they help to anchor the periosteum to the surface of the bone. Okay, and of course we can see here the blood vessel, okay, entering into the bone and further dividing to provide nourishment for the bone. In this picture, we can see we have this is the periosteum. Okay, we have the endosteum that lines the medullary cavity, and we can see how the blood vessel divides to supply the bone. Now let's take a look at subtopics and how far we have gone. So far we have seen the introduction, cartilage, functions of bones, classification of bones, and the gross structure of bones. Now let's take a look at bone markings. We have these bone markings on the external surface of bones, and taking a look at a typical bone, we'll notice that although it does have a smooth appearance, on certain parts of the bone, we actually have some bumpy regions. We have some regions that are unusually smooth. We have some projections. We have some depressions, and just certain features on the surface of the bone. Now, these features, smooth surfaces, projection, depressions, they are all considered as bone markings, and in this video would be classifying the bone markings into 3 categories. Okay, so the bone markings could be projections. A projection would probably be an elevation, a part of the bone that is unusually higher than the rest of the bone. We also have a classification for surfaces. These surfaces are usually joint surfaces or articular surfaces of the bone, and they have certain features. Okay, and the last we'll be considering is depression. Okay, so certain parts of the bones are depressed. Okay, so they are kind of deepened as compared to the rest of the part of the bone. It could also be an opening for a blood vessel or a nerve, as the case may be. We'd be considering in total about 9 or 10 of these bone markings in this video. Now, taking a look at the picture that we have right here in front of us, this picture actually depicts the projections, and there are different types of projections that we could have. So generally, projections are sites of muscle and ligament attachments. Anywhere we have muscle attachment or ligament attachments, we usually have a projection. And just to put it generally, a projection is simply a slight elevation slightly elevated than the general surface of the bone. These projections could be tuberosity. The tuberosity is a large rounded projection, and here in this picture we can see the iliac. So we have the iliac tuberosity right here, and we can see that it's rounded and it's large. So it's a large rounded projection of the bone. Okay, then we have the crest. The crest is a narrow ridge of bone. Okay, so here we can see that we have the iliac crest. Now the iliac crest, take note, it's an elevation also. Okay, so it's an elevation. The thing with most of these bone markings is that they are very similar. Okay, so most of them, just generally projections are just elevation. Now they have different fancy names for these elevations based on where they occur. So a projection on a structure could be a tuberosity, okay, and on another structure it's a crest, based on its location, so to say, and also based on how it appears. Taking a look at the tuberosity, it's more of rounded than narrow. We have the crest, and an example that we have here is the iliac crest. Then we have the trochanter or the trochanter. Okay, so the trochanter that we have here is on the femur. Some of these words are actually used interchangeably, so sometimes we would have tuberosity being interchanged with tubercle. However, the trochanter of the femur is constant. The trochanter is never actually replaced with a tuberosity. So for the trochanter, we have it in the femur, and it's a trochanter of the femur. It's constant. Okay, so it's a constant term used for the femur. So the projections on the proximal head of the femur are called trochanter. They are hardly ever called tuberosity or tubercle. Trochanter is the word for such projection. And then we have the line. Now the line is simply a narrow ridge. It's a narrow ridge of bone, and of course, when we were defining the crest, we also made mention of the fact that the crest is a narrow ridge of bone. However, the crest is usually more prominent as compared to the line. Here in this picture, we can see that we have the intertrochanteric line. Then we have the tubercle. Okay, the tubercle is a small rounded projection. So we have seen the line and then the tubercle. The tubercle is a small rounded projection. When we were considering the tuberosity, we said the tuberosity is a large rounded projection. However, the tubercle is a small rounded projection or process. Okay, and here in this picture, we can see the adductor tubercle of the femur. Also in the humerus, we have the greater and the lesser tubercle, but it's sometimes called the greater and lesser tuberosity. So these terms are actually sometimes interchangeably used, but generally a tubercle is much smaller than a tuberosity. However, because these terms are relative, the tuberosity is larger than the tubercle. However, someone may consider a structure large and another person may say it's actually small. Okay, so these terms are kind of relative. However, the tuberosity is a large rounded projection and it ought to be larger than the tubercle. Okay, then we have the epicondyle. The epicondyle is a raised area on or above a condyle. Okay, so epi means above. As we see, a condyle is actually a rounded articular projection. Okay, so the epicondyle is on or above the condyle. Here in this picture, we can see the medial epicondyle of the femur. We also have the lateral and medial epicondyle in the humerus, and of course it's above the condyles that we have here. The next projection we'll be considering is the spine. In this picture, we can see here we have the spine, the ischial spine. The spine is sharp and slender, and it's often a pointed projection. Now, so far, when we consider the tuberosity, when we consider the trochanter, when we consider the tubercle, we saw that they were all rounded. All of the projections that we considered, of course, apart from the epicondyle, the line, and the crest, they were all rounded. But the major difference was in size. We saw that the tuberosity was large. We saw that the trochanter was very large. Okay, the trochanter, we considered it to be a very large, blunt and irregular shaped process. Now, the spine is very different from all of this in the sense that it's sharp. Okay, so it's not blunt, it's not rounded, it's sharp. The next projection we'd be considering is the process. Now, the process is any bony prominence, and particularly in this picture, we can see the spinous process. Okay, so the process is kind of like a general term for a prominence, so to say. Now let's consider some of the surfaces. We have seen the projections that form bone markings. Now let's take a look at some of the surfaces that form bone markings. And of course, we stated earlier that the projections are usually sites of muscle and ligament attachments. Now, as we'd get to see under the surfaces are actually articular surfaces. They are surfaces of joints and other articular surfaces. The surfaces, as we can see here, would be considering first of all the head. Now, the head is a bony expansion that carries a narrow neck. Generally, for long bones, we have, as stated earlier, we have two ends and a shaft. Usually, the proximal end of the long bone is usually considered to be the head. For example, we have the head of the humerus, we have the head of the femur. As we saw in this picture, we have this surface here is the head of the femur. We have the head of the humerus. Usually the proximal ends of the bone are usually considered to be the head. Considering the picture that we have here, we can see this is the rib bone and we can see the head. This, of course, is an articular surface when considering surfaces. Another surface we'd be considering is the facet. The facet is another articular surface, and the facet is usually smooth and it's a flat articular surface. And here we can also see the facet of the rib bone. Okay, also we have the sternal facet of the clavicle as well as the acromial facet. They are flat articular surfaces, unlike the head, which is a bony expansion that is accompanied by a neck. The next surface we'll be considering is the condyle. Here we can see this is the mandible and we have the condyle here. The condyle is more of a rounded articular surface. Okay, so it's a rounded articular projection, and usually the condyle articulates to a fossa. Okay, so the condyle usually articulates to a fossa. Here in this picture, we also have the condyle. So we can see the condyle here, and we can see that it's rounded. It's a rounded articular projection. And of course, relative to the condyle, that's why we have the epicondyle, okay, forming a projection here. Now, it's good for us to just take note of the fact once again that the projections are majorly sites of muscle and ligament attachment, while the surfaces are articular surfaces, okay, so joint surfaces, and we consider the head, the facet, and the condyle as we had them here. The next category of bone markings would be considering would be the depressions. Now, here in this picture, this is the picture would be considering for the depressions, and the depressions are also called openings. Okay, so it could just be a depression that doesn't go through, that is just on one surface, and it could be an actual opening that penetrates through both surfaces of the bone. Let's take note of the fact that the depressions and openings usually serve as passages for blood vessels and nerves. The first depression we'd be considering is the groove. The groove is a furrow, and just put very simply, the groove is an elongated depression. For example, we have the bicipital groove, We'd go on to see all of this in the upper limb. We have the bicipital groove of the humerus. It's an elongated depression between the greater and lesser tubercle. Right here in this picture, we have a groove here, although it's not so clear, but we can see that we have a groove here in the mandible. Then we have a fissure. A fissure is a narrow slit-like opening. So if we have a surface like this, it's a slit, something like this. Okay, that's a fissure, and we can see the inferior orbital fissure that we have here. Now remember that these depressions and openings are majorly for blood vessel and nerve passage. Okay, then we have the foramen. The foramen is a round or oval opening through a bone. Take note of the fact that the fissure is a slit-like opening. The foramen, on the other hand, is a round oval opening. Okay, so we have here, we can see here a foramen forming part of the facial bone. It's oval or rounded, as the case may be. Then we have a notch. Okay, a notch is an indentation at the edge of a structure. In this picture right here, we can see that we have a notch. This is well depicted in the scapula. In the scapula, we have the suprascapular notch. We can see that for the depressions, they are easily differentiable. Okay, so they are not overlapping terms. They are not synonymous, so to say. They cannot exactly be used interchangeably. So we can say that a foramen is a fissure, because a fissure is slit-like and a foramen is rounded or oval. Also, we can see that the notch is at the edge of the bone. It's an indentation at the edge of a bone. If we have the scapula like this, the scapula is a triangular bone. It's a triangular flat bone. Just at the edge, we have a notch. Okay, this notch is called the suprascapular notch, and as we would go on to see, this suprascapular notch provides a passage. It's not a hole, it's a notch, it's an indentation. However, this suprascapular notch with a ligament forms kind of like a canal. Okay, so we would have an overlying ligament, a ligament that transverse the notch, and it provides a canal for the suprascapular nerve, as we'd go on to see in the upper limb. There are other depressions apart from the groove, the fissure, the foramen, and the notch. We have other depressions. We have the meatus. The meatus is a canal-like passageway. Now notice that these terms are not in any way overlapping. A fissure, slit-like, foramen, oval, notch is an indentation at the edge. Okay, now the meatus is a canal-like opening. We can see here we have the meatus here. It's a canal-like passageway. Okay, then we have the sinus. The sinus is a cavity within a bone that is filled with air. It's filled with air and lined with mucous membrane. Okay, so we can see the sinus here. You can see it's just a cavity within the bone. And of course, we have the fossa. The fossa is another depression. Now, when we're considering articular surfaces, we saw the condyle, and we said that the condyle usually articulates with the fossa. Okay, so fossa. And the fossa is simply a shallow basin-like structure. It's usually very smooth. In this picture here, we can see it's not well depicted, but we can see that we have the fossa here. Also, we have the occipital condyle from the skull, and then we have the occipital fossa on the vertebral bone. So these are essentially all of the bone markings that we'll be considering for this video. Just a quick recap. We saw the projections, where we considered the tuberosity, which we said is large. Then we saw the trochanter. We said the trochanter is very large and rounded. Then we saw the tubercle. We said the tubercle is small and rounded. We said the spine is very peculiar because it's not rounded, it's sharp. Then we said that the crest is a narrow ridge, kind of like an elevation, a narrow elevation, and we said it's much bigger than a line. So when we have a supposed crest that is small, it's most likely a line. The crest is more prominent, usually more prominent. Then of course we saw the epicondyle, which is just above or on the condyle. Okay, so we saw all of this under the projections, and we said the projections are surfaces for muscle and ligament attachment. Then we went on to look at the surfaces. We said the surfaces are articular surfaces. Then we looked at the depressions and openings, and we said that they provide a passageway for nerves and blood vessels. So let's see how far we have gone on our outline. So far we have gone through the introduction, cartilage, functions of bone, classification of bones, and the gross anatomy of bones, as well as bone markings. Now let's take a look at the microscopic structure of bones. This video is actually made for gross anatomy, and the microscopic structure of bone would be studied more elaborately in the histology of bones. However, we'll go over it very briefly in this video, studying the microscopic structure of bones. In considering the microscopic structure of bones, of course, we'd be taking a look at the cells that make up the bone. There are 5 major cell types that make up the bone. We have the osteoclast, the osteoblast, the osteocytes, then we have the bone lining cells, and then lastly we have the osteoprogenitor cells. This should have come first. We would consider each of these cells very briefly, one after the other. It's important for us to take note of the fact that all of the cells that we have considered so far originate from the embryonic connective tissue. So that's the mesenchymal cells. When we consider connective tissues, we would see that connective tissues develop from the embryonic connective tissue cells, which are called mesenchymal cells. Okay, now all of the cells that we have listed, so starting from the osteoblast to the osteoprogenitor cells, all of these cells originate from the embryonic connective tissue cells, aka mesenchymal cells. And it's the presence of cells. Of course, we know that cells are the basic structural and functional unit of life. Now, the presence of cells in this bone is actually what makes it a living tissue. The first cell would be considering would be the osteoprogenitor cells. So let's take a look at the osteoprogenitor cells. Now, the osteoprogenitor cells are stem cells. By virtue of being stem cells, they are undifferentiated. Now, when the need arises, these cells are differentiated and they form the osteoblast. Okay, and as we'd see, the osteoblast would go on to secrete the matrix and then become osteocytes. The osteoblasts are the cells that secrete the matrix. Okay, so it's good for us to keep in mind in all that we study that the bones are connective tissues, and typical of all connective tissues, they have an extracellular matrix. It's made of the ground substance and fibers. Okay, so the osteoblast is basically what secretes the matrix. When they become surrounded by this matrix, they become osteocytes. Let's take a look at osteocytes. These are the actual bone cells. So osteo means bone or has to do with the bone, and site means cells. So osteocytes are literally bone cells. And unlike the osteoblast, which are very mitotically active, the osteocytes are dormant. Okay, so they are not mitotically active, they are just dormant, and basically the osteoblast is what becomes the osteocyte when it's surrounded by the matrix. Of course, the osteocytes are mature, they are mature bone cells, and they are surrounded by a lacuna. Okay, or lacunae. Next, we have the bone lining cells. The bone lining cells are flat cells that are found on the bone surface, and they are found where the bone is not remodeling. Now, remodeling has to do with formation and reabsorption of bone. Okay, and it's bone remodeling that helps to keep the bone in good shape. So when remodeling is not taking place, we have the bone lining cells. Next, of course, we have the osteoclasts. The osteoclasts are giant multinucleated cells, okay, and they are located at the site of bone reabsorption. They are sometimes called bone destroying cells, but this is not in a bad way, because these osteoclasts have to break down bone for new bone to be formed. Okay, so they help in reabsorption of bone. And as we would see, when there is a drop in the calcium level in the body, so we saw earlier that the bone serves as a mineral storage. When there is a drop in the calcium level in the body, what happens is that these osteocytes help to reabsorb the bone so that calcium can be released. Taking a look at the microscopic structure of bone, especially the microscopic structure of long bones, the structural and functional unit of the compact bone is the osteon, and the osteon is made of these matrix tubes of lamella. Alright, so we have something that looks like this. So we can see here this matrix, this concentric tubes coming together to form a unit of osteon. So this structure that we have here is a structural unit of the compact bone, and it's called an osteon. And the osteon is made of concentric matrix tubes called the lamella, and this matrix tube have a central canal through which blood vessels and nerves pass through. Now this entire system of the lamella and the central canal is known as the Haversian system, and the central canal that we have there is the Haversian canal, and we have blood vessels and nerves passing through that canal. Taking a look at the picture that we have here, we can see how the osteons come together to form the compact bone. We have the Haversian canal, and also we can see that we have a perforating canal. Now the perforating canal perforates through the compact bone along the shorter axis. In the picture that we have here, we can see that it's transverse to the length of the bone, and it perforates through to the medullary cavity. Now this perforating canal is also called the Volkmann canal. The Volkmann canal lies at right angle to the long axis of the bone, okay, and it connects the nervous and blood supply of the medullary cavity. So we can see here, this is the medullary cavity made of a thin layer of spongy bone. Now it supplies the nervous and blood supply of the medullary cavity to that of the central canal. Generally, the Haversian system looks something like this. So we have the lamella, the matrix tube, concentric matrix tube going round. This is a structural unit of osteon. At the edge of each ring, we have the osteocytes. The osteocytes are in a lacunae, kind of like a housing, a hollow housing. So at the junction between two lamella, this would be the lamella, a matrix tube lamella. At the junction between two adjacent lamella, you have the osteocytes in the lacunae. Okay, so here they are represented in red, and you have these hair-like projections coming out from the lacunae. They help to interconnect the osteocytes. Okay, it's an interconnection, and these hair-like canals are called the canalicunae. So we have this canalicunae radiating in this manner. Coming back to this picture right here, we can see that we have, in this picture, we have labeled the circumferential lamella, and we also have, although not labeled, we also have the interstitial lamella. If we have something like this, so this is a unit of osteon, and of course we have the lamella. This is another unit of osteon. We have the lamella, and so on. Now the interstitial lamella, if we take a look at this, we have an intact lamella. So this lamella is intact and it's complete, and it forms part of an osteon. However, between the two osteon, we have this space. Now, this space is not left empty, it's actually occupied by lamella. However, this lamella or matrix tube do not necessarily form part of the osteon, so they are kind of incomplete. Okay, so we could have some here as well. They are kind of incomplete. So this incomplete lamella is what forms the interstitial lamella, and the circumferential lamella is basically what surrounds the entire osteon. So if this is the entire region of the compact bone, that the circumferential lamella is what goes around the entire all of the osteon unit, and we have that well shown in the picture here. We can see that the circumferential lamella goes around, okay, and it's located just deep to the periosteum. So if we look clearly in this picture, we can see the periosteum here. Here we can see the periosteum, and just deep to the periosteum we have all of these circumferential lamella. They do not essentially form a part of the osteon, okay, but of course they kind of circumference the osteon. Okay, now this is what we'll be considering for the microscopic structure of the bone too. Let's move on to the next subtopic for this video. The next subtopic for this video is the composition of the bone. Now, in considering the chemical composition of the bone, or the general composition of the bone, we get to see that the bone is made of the inorganic composition as well as the organic composition. The organic component of the bone, as you would expect, is soft. Now, most living tissues and most living structures are soft, and this is generally due to the presence of water in those structures. Okay, so they are usually soft, flexible, bendable, and so on. However, the inorganic component of the bone is of course made of mineral salts, and as expected, this mineral salt give the bone its rigidity and strength and so on. It's so important because in as much as we want the bone to be rigid, excessive rigidity would actually make the bone brittle. So an excessive mineralization of the bone would make it brittle, and so it would be easily broken. Taking a look at the organic composition of the bone, this is what gives the bone its flexibility. However, an excessive amount of organic component of the bone would make the bone lose its rigidity. So basically, we're considering two properties. We're considering rigidity and flexibility. These two properties of the bone have to be balanced, so to say, in order to give the bone its overall strength of compressibility and tensile strength, as well as flexibility. When one side is disrupted, there's of course an imbalance in the structure of the bone, and we'll get to see all of this. Now, the organic component of the bone is made up of bone cells. So far we have seen some of the bone cells. We have seen the osteocytes, we have seen the osteoprogenitor cells, we have seen the osteoblast, the bone lining cells, as well as the osteoclast. The osteoid is the organic part of the bone matrix, and it forms about 2/3 of the bone matrix, as we'd go on to see. It includes ground substance and collagen fibers, and all of this is of course secreted by the osteoblast. As we saw earlier, the secretion of the bone matrix is done by the osteoblast. Now, the organic component, as earlier stated, is what gives the bone its flexibility and tensile strength. Okay, this is what allows the bone to resist stretching and twisting. Now, taking a look at the inorganic component of bone. The inorganic component of bone is made of inorganic hydroxyapatite or mineral salts, and these mineral salts, usually mineral salts of calcium, majorly calcium phosphate, and it's this inorganic components that actually makes bone to be very long lasting. So we can see that when an organism dies, of course, we have decay occurring to the flesh and internal organs, but we'd see that the bone remains even after decades, and this is majorly due to the inorganic component of bone. Now, going by our outline, so far we have considered all of this as well as the composition of bones. The next would be considering is ossification. Ossification is also called osteogenesis, and it's simply the formation of bone tissues. So in embryonic life, the process of osteogenesis or ossification is basically for the formation of the bony skeleton. Okay, so for the formation of the skeletal framework of the body. While in adult life, osteogenesis or ossification mainly serves the process of bone remodeling. As we stated earlier, bone remodeling is the process of bone reabsorption and formation. Okay, now there are two types of ossification that we'll be considering in this video. These are endochondral ossification as well as intramembranous ossification. Okay, so these are the two types of ossification that we'll be considering in this video. Now, it's also very important for us to take note of the fact that before week 8 in the embryonic life, what we have is that the skeletal framework of the embryo is basically made of cartilage. So it's made of cartilage and fibrous connective tissue membrane. At week 8 and going forward, what we have is that this cartilage and fibrous connective tissue membrane would be gradually converted into bone, and this is both, it's by the process of endochondral ossification for the cartilage and intramembranous ossification for the fibrous connective tissue. So we'll take a look at all of this. Now, it's also very important for us to take note of the fact that the specific cartilage that forms the model, that forms the model for the bony framework is actually the hyaline cartilage. What happens is that we have this cartilage basically taking the form of the bone. So we have, maybe this is the form the bone is supposed to take. So we have this hyaline cartilage taking this form, so it forms a cartilaginous model, and so through the process of ossification, this cartilaginous model of the bone is converted into the actual bone, as we shall see in these two types of ossification. So firstly, let's take a look at endochondral ossification. Taking a look at the term, we have endo and we have chondral. Now, endo means within or inside, and chondral has to do with the cartilage. So endochondral, as a direct translation, means within cartilage. Okay, now basically what happens in endochondral ossification is that the hyaline cartilage is gradually replaced. Okay, it's gradually replaced by bone, and it leads to the formation of an endochondral bone. Now, it's very important for us to take note of the fact that most of the long bones of the body, apart from the clavicle is an exception here, and as we shall see, this is one of the peculiarities of the clavicle. It's kind of like the only long bone in the body that doesn't exhibit endochondral ossification. Although some text would have that some part of the clavicle exhibits endochondral ossification and some part exhibits intramembranous ossification, but generally ossification for the cartilage is the intramembranous ossification. Most text would have that the clavicle exhibits intramembranous ossification. Okay, now of course we have the intramembranous ossification. Now, intra means within. Remember, as we stated earlier, we stated that in the embryo before week 8, the skeletal framework of the embryo is basically made of cartilage and fibrous connective tissue membrane. We saw that in the endochondral ossification, we have this cartilage being gradually converted into bone. However, for the intramembranous ossification, what we have is that the bone is formed within, it's formed within the fibrous connective tissue membrane. It basically develops from this fibrous membrane, and the bone that is formed is called a membranous bone. It's also good for us to take note of the fact that most of the bones formed by intramembranous ossification are flat bones. Okay, now for this video, would consider the endochondral ossification more in depthly than the intramembranous ossification, and would examine this ossification in 5 steps. In the picture that we have here, we can see that we have the 5 steps of the endochondral ossification represented in this picture. In the first step of the endochondral ossification, of course, it's a hyaline cartilage. Okay, the hyaline cartilage is basically what forms the bone model. So we have this hyaline cartilage forming the bone model, and typical of all cartilage, it has a perichondrium. All of this is taking place in embryonic life. So basically we have embryonic connective tissue, and forming this embryonic connective tissue is embryonic connective tissue cells, aka mesenchymal cells. Now these mesenchymal cells are stem cells, okay, and they are undifferentiated. Now the process of ossification begins when these mesenchymal cells become differentiated into osteoblasts. Okay, now these mesenchymal cells basically line the inner layer of the perichondrium, and they become differentiated into osteoblast. Now, of course, we earlier saw that the osteoblasts are the matrix secreting cell of bone. Okay, so they secrete the bone matrix. Now, this osteoblast is formed and it secretes the bone matrix. By virtue of this process, the perichondrium is converted into periosteum. The osteoblast would secrete this bony collar on the surface of the hyaline cartilage, just as we have here. So we can see here indicated in this picture the bony collar, and we can see that we have the formation of the primary ossification center. However, we still have the hyaline cartilage here. So what happens in the first step, we have the bony collar or a bone collar that forms around the diaphysis, okay, which is basically the shaft. Now, as I stated earlier, endochondral ossification majorly takes place in long bones. In fact, apart from the clavicle, all the bones below the base of the skull are formed by endochondral ossification. Okay, now the bony collar has been formed. What next? What takes place in the next step is that we have the cartilage that is still present. Okay, so we can still see the hyaline cartilage. Now the hyaline cartilage that has been surrounded by this bony collar is hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is simply an enlargement, and since we're referring to a cell hypertrophy is cell enlargement. Okay, so the cell becomes enlarged, and in addition to being enlarged, it becomes calcified. Okay, so the cartilage becomes calcified. Now, when we were considering the differences between bones and cartilage, we stated that calcified cartilage is different from bone, and this is because looking fundamentally at the structure and the cells that make up cartilage and the cells that make up bone, we can see that they are different. The chondrocytes or the cartilaginous cells become hypertrophed, and then they become calcified, and this takes place in the center of the diaphysis. Okay, so we can see the area of deteriorating cartilage matrix. This is what would go on to form the medullary cavity of the long bone. First, what we had is that we had mesenchymal cells, okay, which are the embryonic connective tissue cells. We had them specializing, differentiating into osteoblasts. Okay, so we had this osteoblast secreting a bony matrix and forming a bone collar and the diaphysis of this cartilaginous model. Okay, in the next step, we had the calcification of the chondrocyte at the center of the bone model. And now it's good for us to take note of the fact that we earlier stated that cartilages are not vascularized. Okay, so they are not vascularized, but we also stated that they are surrounded by a pericondium that provides nourishment for the chondrocytes. Now, calcification of the cartilage would mean that they would be sort of impermeable to this nutrient from the perichondrium. I'll say that again. Calcification of the chondrocyte makes them impermeable, so to say, to the nutrients that they would originally get from the perichondrium. And this, of course, would lead to deterioration of the cartilaginous matrix, as we can see in the second picture. What happens in the third picture here is that the periosteal board invades the internal cavity and the spongy bone forms. Now, what exactly is the periosteal board? The periosteal board is made of the nutrient artery and the vein. It's made of the red marrow cells or the red marrow elements. It's also made of nerves, the osteoprogenitor cells, as well as the osteoclasts. The periosteal board invades the internal cavity of the developing bone. The osteoclast partially plays a role in further deteriorating the calcified cartilage. In the fourth picture, which is at birth, is that we have that the primary ossification center enlarges, and then we have the diaphysis. So the diaphysis elongates. So the diaphysis is basically the shaft of the long bone. It elongates and the medullary cavity is formed. Also, we can see the formation of the secondary ossification center at the epiphysis. Lastly, in the fifth stage, which is childhood to adolescence, in the fifth bone structure, is that we have the epiphysis ossifies. Okay, so initially we can see that at birth the most part of the epiphysis is made of cartilage. However, from childhood to adolescence, this cartilaginous epiphysis gradually becomes ossified. After the ossification of the epiphysis is completed, we have the hyaline cartilage remaining at the epiphyseal plate. Okay, so this is the epiphyseal plate, the hyaline cartilage, and this basically allows for the accommodation of growth. Okay, so it allows for growth to take place. We also have the hyaline cartilage also forming the articular cartilage, as we can see here, for the joint surfaces. Now, the intramembranous ossification also takes place in a similar fashion. However, what we have is that it takes place majorly in the flat bones of the skull. So we have the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal bone, as well as in the clavicle. Okay, now of course this takes place within the fibrous connective tissue membrane. Now, taking a look at our outline, we have considered all of this and as well as ossification. Now, very quickly, would consider bone growth, then remodeling, bone repair, and bone disorders. So let's take a look at bone growth. Taking a look at bone growth, okay, this is also one of the characteristics of bone, so to say, that further portrays that bone is actually living. Okay, so the bone is not just a dead structure of the body, it's actually living. And bone grows in two ways. Okay, so bone grows by increase in length, and we also have an increase in width. Most of the processes that take place in bone growth are essentially the processes that take place in endochondral ossification. However, we'd be looking at the growth zones. Okay, so the increase in length or the longitudinal growth of bone is associated with the epiphyseal plate. Okay, while the increase in width is associated with the periosteum. And this makes sense because the periosteum surrounds the surface of the bone. So an increase in the width would of course be linked to the periosteum. And looking at the longitudinal growth, it's associated with the epiphyseal plate or the epiphyseal cartilage. Okay, now we'll be looking at the zones of growth for the epiphyseal cartilage. Given a long bone that looks something like this, okay, so we have this long bone in blue, we have the epiphyseal cartilage, and then we have the epiphysis. I would represent the epiphysis in red. Now, the part of the epiphyseal cartilage that is on the side of the epiphysis. So let's take a look at this. The region of the epiphyseal cartilage that is closer to the epiphysis, so this region highlighted in yellow, is known as the resting zone. And this is because this region of the epiphyseal cartilage does not take part in the longitudinal growth. Okay, so it's not part of the growing zone, so to say. Let's enlarge this epiphyseal cartilage so we can take a clearer look at what it looks like. So take, for instance, this is the epiphyseal cartilage enlarged. This is the resting zone, the part that is closer to the epiphysis, so it's the resting zone. Just below the resting zone, what we have is the proliferative zone. The proliferative zone, also known as the growth zone, is just below the resting zone, and it's actively dividing. By dividing and proliferating, it kind of pushes the epiphysis. Okay, so it pushes the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. Now, below the proliferative zone, what we have is the hypertrophic zone. Okay, so this is the proliferative zone, and then below the proliferative zone of the epiphyseal cartilage, we have the hypertrophic zone. Now, what takes place in the hypertrophic zone is that the older cartilage, okay, now remember that proliferation takes place here, so we would always have newer cartilage close to the resting zone, and of course it's expected that the older cartilage would be below the proliferative zone. Okay, proliferation takes place upwards. Okay, so we'd have older cartilages at the hypertrophic zone, and these older cartilages basically enlarge. Okay, so hypertrophy, they enlarge at the hypertrophic zone. Below the hypertrophic zone, what we have is the calcification zone. Now remember, I said earlier that the process of bone growth somewhat mimics the endochondral ossification, because in the endochondral ossification we have hypertrophy, then we have calcification, and here in bone growth we also have hypertrophy of these older cartilage cells, and then we have calcification. So the calcification zone is below the hypertrophic zone. Now remember that all of these are zones of the epiphyseal cartilage or the epiphyseal plate. This is the calcification zone. Just as we saw in endochondral ossification, these hypertrophed cartilage cells become calcified. Okay, and calcification of the cartilage cells means that they will become impermeable to the diffuse nutrients. By becoming impermeable to the diffuse nutrients, they deteriorate and die off. Okay, and what happens is that in the ossification zone, what happens is that new bone is formed. Okay, in the ossification zone. As a recap, we have this long bone, and just between the epiphysis and the diaphysis we have the epiphyseal plate, which is a remnant of hyaline cartilage after the epiphysis is ossified. Okay, so remember that after the epiphysis becomes ossified, we have hyaline cartilage at the articular surface, and we also have hyaline cartilage between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And this, as I said earlier, allows for the accommodation of bone growth, specifically longitudinal bone growth. Okay, so we have the resting zone, which is the part of the epiphyseal plate closer to the epiphysis. In this zone, it's not active in division. Then we have the proliferative zone, just below the resting zone, the hypertrophic zone, the calcification zone, and the ossification zone. Now, it's important for us to take note of the fact that over time, as the bone continues to increase in length and the individual continues to age and grow and increase, okay, this epiphyseal plate actually continues to grow thinner till it totally disappears. Okay, so what we have after the epiphyseal cartilage or the epiphyseal plate is totally gone is an epiphyseal closure or an epiphyseal plate closure. Of course, the absence of the epiphyseal plate due to epiphyseal plate closure means that the bone would no longer be able to increase in length. It takes place at about the age of 18 in females and at the age of 21 in males. Okay, so of course, longitudinal bone growth would stop when the epiphyseal cartilage is totally converted into bone tissue. Now, when this happens, what we would have between the epiphysis and the diaphysis would simply be a line, the epiphyseal line. So it will no longer be a plate but a line. Okay, now let's take a look at the increase in width. Taking a look at the increase in width for bones, we said that it's associated with the periosteum. Now, earlier on in this video, when we were considering the periosteum, we saw that the inner layer of the periosteum, that is the part of the periosteum closer to the bone surface, okay, contains osteoprogenitor cells as well as osteoblasts. Okay, now this osteoblast sets a new matrix for appositional growth. Okay, and then osteoclasts on the endosteal layer, that's on the interior of the bone. Osteoclasts help to break down the bone. So if this is the bone surface, the osteoblast would secrete a new matrix for bone formation, and then we have kind of like an increase in the width. Okay, so this is the medullary cavity. We have an increase in the width of the bone. Now, osteoclasts on the interior would help to break down. So what the osteoclasts would do, they would break down the bone from the interior. We have an increase as well as a decrease. Now, what happens is that the decrease is usually less than the increase. So overall, we have an increase in the width of the bone. Let's take a look at the hormonal regulation of bone growth. Now, it's very important for us to take note of the fact that in infancy as well as in childhood, the activities of the epiphyseal plate is regulated by growth hormones. These growth hormones are released by the anterior pituitary gland. So in infancy as well as in childhood, the activities of the epiphyseal plate is regulated and controlled by the growth hormones. Now, in adolescence, okay, at puberty, we have an increase in sex hormones. So we have estrogen. Estrogen plays a role in bone growth, and this is why, because of an increase in estrogen at puberty, both in male and female, so it's good for us to take note of the fact that, of course, the principal sex hormone in male is testosterone, but some of the circulating testosterone is converted into estrogen, and it plays a role in bone growth. And increased estrogen level over time in puberty actually leads to what we earlier considered as the epiphyseal plate closure, which means that longitudinal bone growth is stopped. However, at puberty, the sex hormones now play a role in epiphyseal plate activity. Initially, childhood, infancy, what we have is the growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. At puberty, we have the sex hormones playing a key role. Also, it's good for us to take note of the fact that the feminization or masculinization of certain bones bones of the body, especially the hip bone, is due to the sex hormones. So depending on the amount of testosterone or estrogen, these bones are actually either feminized or masculinized. Okay, and this is just to be particularly to the hip bone, and that's why one of the secondary sex characteristics at puberty, especially for the female, is the increase in the hip. And this is due to the feminization of the hip bone as a result of the higher estrogen level, and masculinization of course will take place in the male because of the higher testosterone level. It's also important for us to take note of the fact that over time, okay, an increase in the estrogen level would induce the epiphyseal plate closure, as we saw earlier. Taking a look at our outline, we have considered bone growth, and the next subtopic for this video is bone remodeling. Okay, so let's take a look at bone remodeling. Bone remodeling involves two contrasting processes. Bone remodeling involves both the process of bone reabsorption as well as bone deposition. The key player in bone reabsorption is the osteoclast. The osteoclast is what helps to break down the bones. Basically, the osteoclast releases lysosomal enzymes, and it also helps to secrete acid. These are the two degrading factors of the osteoclast. Now remember that in the bone we have the organic part of the bone as well as the inorganic component of the bone, or composition of the bone. Now the lysosomal enzymes basically help to digest the organic matrix. They help to digest the organic part of the bone, while the acidic secretion of the osteoclast helps to break down the inorganic component of the bone, so the mineral salts, the inorganic hydroxyapatite, and of course these minerals are released and they are transported to the bloodstream. And as we would go on to see, this bone reabsorption could actually take place when there is a deficiency of minerals, for example calcium. Then bone reabsorption could take place so that these minerals can be transported into the blood. Now of course, because the osteoclast meant for bone reabsorption or breaking down of bones, once they are done with their job, they undergo a programmed cell death. And this is necessary because if this doesn't take place, then the bone would continue to be reabsorbed and destroyed. Okay, so the osteoclast would have to undergo a programmed cell death, and this is apoptosis. Now, following after bone reabsorption is of course bone deposition. The key player in bone deposition is the osteoblast. The osteoblast help to secrete new bone matrix, okay, and it begins as osteoid, which is unmineralized. This osteoid is then calcified, and this of course forms the calcified bone matrix. It's important for us to take note of the fact that remodeling is a continuous process, and it's controlled by two factors, and that is in maintaining the calcium ion homeostasis as well as in keeping the bone strong. It's also very important for us to take note of an important law which is called the Wolff's law. Now Wolff's law states that, or is paraphrased, that bone grows in response to stress. So the more stress applied on a bone, the more likely it is to grow, and the less stress applied on the bone, the less likely it is to grow. Put in a different way, bone grows or remodels in response to the demand placed on it. Of course, when we make use of the bone, it's being subjected to stress and it's more likely to grow. Going by our outline, we just considered bone remodeling, Next, we'll be considering is bone repair. We considered bone remodeling. We saw that it's a continuous process of bone reabsorption and deposition. It's kind of like the shedding of skin. Okay, it takes place continually. However, bone repair comes to play where there is a damage to the bone, and this damage is usually in the form of fracture. And for this video, we'll be taking a look at some of the ways in which fracture is classified. So fracture could be displaced or non-displaced. When the bone breaks, if it remains in position, then it's non-displaced. However, if it shifts out of its original position, then it is displaced. This is based on the position of the bone after the fracture, the position of the end of the bone after the fracture. Now, depending on the completeness of the fracture, does the fracture actually break through the entirety of the bone, or is it more or less just a crack? Now, based on the completeness of the fracture, we could have a complete fracture and an incomplete fracture. Okay, so for displaced, if we have a bone like this is the original position of the bone, and then when fracture occurs, the bone still remains in this position, then this is non-displaced. However, if we have something like this with the bone leaving its original position, then this would be displaced. Now, completeness, both of these fractures depict complete fracture. Okay, so the bone is actually completely broken. However, we could have something like this. We can see that it's just a partial break. This is just a partial break. It's an incomplete fracture. The bone doesn't actually break into two. Okay, and this is, as we would go on to see, it's associated with grain stick fracture. Then we have an open fracture. An open fracture is also called a compound fracture. So open or compound, and then we have the closed or simple fracture. An open fracture, as the name implies, the end of the bone penetrates through the skin. Okay, so the end of the bone penetrates to the skin such that the bone is actually on the surface. You can see the bone through the surface. It penetrates through the surface of the skin. Okay, while for a closed fracture or a simple fracture, the bone is broken but it remains in the skin. Okay, so you can't see the ends of the bone outside the skin. Okay, this is a closed fracture. We're taking a look at bone repair due to fracture, and it takes place in steps, and we'll consider each of the steps. Alright, so the picture that we have here shows the steps of bone repair. Firstly, we have that the hematoma is formed. Just before we take a look at the bone repair, let's take a look at bone treatment. Now, the term reduction is used for the realignment of broken bones. We could have a closed reduction or an open reduction. In a closed reduction, we simply have the physician actually just simply using hands to realign the broken bones to their original position. So that's a closed reduction. It's literally closed. However, for an open reduction, okay, it's more so surgical. The ends of the bones are secured using screws, and they are kept in place by a surgical process. So it's open because the skin is actually pierced to get to the bone, and then it's realigned. Okay, it's reduction. So this is fracture treatment. And then taking a look at the bone repair, it takes place in about 4 steps. First, the hematoma is formed. Now, hematoma is actually blood cloth. Okay, it's an internal blood cloth. Generally, when we have an injury, in order to stop bleeding, then the blood clots or coagulates. Okay, now what happens in hematoma? It's unlike the external blood cloth. It's an internal blood cloth. So basically, when the bone breaks, as we stated earlier, it penetrates through the periosteum. And remember that we saw initially that the periosteum is supplied with blood vessels. Penetrating and breaking through the periosteum, it actually breaks through blood vessels. Okay, so of course, bleeding would take place. Now, the hematoma is actually the clothing of this blood. That's the first step that takes place. And in the next step, we can see that the fibrocartilage callus forms. Now, this cartilage is actually a soft, this callus rather is a soft callus. Okay, as we see, it's a soft callus, and we can also see that within the soft callus, the blood vessels are actually reformed. So initially here in the first picture, we had here that the blood vessels had been broken. However, we can see that they are being reformed, and we have the fibrocartilage. So generally, when we were looking at bone remodeling, we saw that it was strictly hyaline cartilage, endochondral ossification hyaline cartilage. It's important for us to take note that in bone repair, what we have is actually a fibrocartilaginous callus and not hyaline cartilage. Also, we can see new blood vessels are formed in the next step. Then we have the bony callus. The bony callus is formed in the third picture. Okay, and this now is a hard callus. And of course, we can see here in the fourth picture that bone remodeling takes place, reabsorption and deposition. Okay, and the fracture is healed, and it's just as if there was never a fracture before. Very interesting. So far, we have seen all of this as well as bone repair. Now we'll take a look at bone disorders. The first bone disorder we'll be considering is osteomalacia. Osteomalacia is associated with poorly mineralized bone in adults. When we were considering the chemical composition of bones, we saw that we're looking at two key factors: flexibility and rigidity. We said the inorganic component of bone gives it its rigidity, and the organic component gives it its flexibility. Now, polymineralized bone, of course, has less inorganic components, and it means that it is soft and weak. The next bone disorder would be considering is rickets. Now, rickets is analogous to osteomalacia in adults. Now, rickets is in children. It's also associated with polymineralized bone, but it's even worse. It's worse than osteomalacia in adults. Rickets in children is worse because the bones are still growing rapidly. These two bone disorders are caused majorly by nutritional deficiency of calcium, and it could also be to insufficient vitamin D or vitamin D deficiency. We know that we get vitamin D from sunlight, exposure to sunlight, especially early morning sunlight. So in places where there is little or no sunlight due to the position of such regions away from the equator, the people living in such regions may suffer from osteomalacia or rickets because of the vitamin D deficiency. The next bone disorder would be considering is osteoporosis. This majorly takes place in the elderly. Okay, it takes place in much older people, especially older women. Okay, and it's associated with an excessive bone reabsorption. Osteoporosis is actually not one particular disease. Okay, so it's a It's actually a group of diseases where the bone reabsorption exceeds bone deposition. Alright, so that's what we have for bone disorders. For this video, we'd only be considering osteomalacia, rickets, and osteoporosis. However, there are a lot of other bone disorders like the Paget's disease. We also have certain bone conditions like achondroplasia, osteogenesis imperfecta, osteomyelitis, osteitis, and a lot of other bone disorders. However, for this video, we only briefly considered osteomalacia, rickets, and osteoporosis. Now, considering our outline for this video, we have come to the end of the video today. We had a lot to discuss on that bones. Thank you for watching the video to the end. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Bye.